In January, President Trump signed phase one of a trade deal with China. The agreement suspended planned tariffs. China committed to buying at least $200 billion in U.S. agricultural products over the next 2 years. The deal also included provisions on intellectual property. A new book explores trade secrets and U.S. relations with China. It's called The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. My colleague Vladimir Duthiers spoke with the author, Mara Hvistendahl. Here's part of that conversation.
How did you land on the story? Like, what piqued your interest?
One day I read this article about a man named Robert Moe who was found in a cornfield in Iowa, and it was a Monsanto cornfield. His appearance there sparked a 2-year FBI investigation where the Bureau flew surveillance planes overhead, staged car chases, and took out a warrant reserved for national security threats. So I read the article and I thought, well, that's an interesting
What a
case.
story.
Yeah.
and you say that this story sort of begins with these 3 ethnic Chinese guys that are caught trespassing, and I say that in air quotes, in this field belonging to Monsanto, and what may have seemed innocuous at the time turned out to be what?
It turned out to be that they were working for a Beijing agricultural company called DBN, and DBN had hatched this idea to come up with a shortcut, a way of reverse engineering corn. Many Chinese have been eating more and more meat as the country's developed. People are eating higher up the food chain. In order to get that meat, you need animal feed, which often comes from corn. And so China has this large population and relatively little arable land. And so there's a need for better corn.
Let's set for our viewers an understanding and a sense of what industrial espionage is and ultimately what the goals are.
In addition to espionage that happens for national security purposes, there is industrial espionage which targets companies' trade secrets. And that could be dual-use military technologies like Boeing aircraft, or it could be things like the whitener that is used in Oreo cookies. China has developed on just an immense scale, and the government has prioritized breakthroughs at any cost. So that has led many people to go out and steal secrets instead of wait for them. It might take 10 or 20 years for a company to come up with a breakthrough on its own. And that's certainly what happened in the seed case. It wasn't that the Chinese government sent people to go out and steal corn. It was that there's this priority on agricultural technology, on coming up with new seed lines and feeding the population. Is
the United States the #1 target for industrial espionage from China, or are they equally active in, for example, France and other countries, and perhaps even Russia?
Definitely other countries are targeted as well. Say the United States is unique in our reaction to industrial espionage, and that it's here that the Justice Department has made a big priority of combating it and has had to carve out this stance that industrial espionage is morally wrong.
Is the United States winning, losing, or is it kind of a stalemate when it comes to the attempts by China to continuously target the United States through industrial espionage?
That's a good question. It depends on how you define winning. And I would argue that if you look at the case of Robert Moe, the U.S. government spent untold amounts of money going after him, investigating him, prosecuting him. In the end, he did go to prison, but there were 6 other people who did not, who are still on the FBI's most wanted list, who are back in China. And, in the end, the company at the center of this scheme, DBN, is doing just fine. They may have the trade secrets that they targeted, and they may now be using it to come up with corn seed lines. And so if the end goal is to stop trade secret stuff, then it has not been a big success.
Throughout the course of American history, there have been moments when xenophobia has been applied to people of Chinese descent in this country, going back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And I wonder how this war between China and the United States, this espionage war, is playing out in that regard.
That is definitely a huge factor. So in the course of my reporting for this book, I went back and looked at historically what the FBI's treatment of Chinese American scientists has been. And I uncovered a previously undisclosed FBI program, started in the 1960s under J. Edgar Hoover and continued into the late 1970s to monitor Chinese Americans, including, in many cases, US citizens. The FBI says it's just following the evidence, that these are cases that happen organically, that they look at somebody found in a cornfield and then see where it goes. But even in the case of Robert Moe, his ethnicity played a role pretty early on. But by the time his case was about to go to trial, it had become so fraught that the judge ruled that his ethnicity could not be mentioned unnecessarily.
In the course of your reporting, have you found that criminal prosecution of those who commit industrial espionage is the best way to prevent it, or at least to mitigate it?
Well, one person I spoke to compared cases like this seed case to fighting a drug war by going after the drug runners, like going after the guys on the corner who are selling drugs. And you could argue that it's a strategy, but it's not going to solve the problem of the cartels, and it's not going to solve the problem of the people above them who are giving them orders. And that is what's happening with many of these cases. So we've seen a massive rise in investigations and these dozens of cases brought over the past few years, but the issue of industrial espionage from China is not stopping.